October 1944. The air over the Rhineland was thick with the scent of wet coal and the metallic tang of distant artillery. In the village of Kahl, tucked into the rugged folds of the Eifel forest, the morning fog clung to the timber-framed houses like a burial shroud. For years, the silence here had been a curated thing, a byproduct of the Reich's iron-fisted control and the deepening isolation of a nation being squeezed from all sides. The only sound was the rhythmic, hollow clop of a lone horse pulling a cart of turnips, driven by an old man whose two sons had vanished into the frozen earth of the Eastern Front. The villagers lived in a state of suspended animation, a quiet desperation fueled by the propaganda of the Wunderwaffe and the belief that the fatherland was an impenetrable fortress. Then came the vibration. It was not the sharp, terrifying whistle of a falling bomb, but a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the forest. It was the sound of 1,000 engines, a mechanical heartbeat that grew until the windows in the village square began to rattle in their frames. The civilians emerged from their doorways, clutching thin wool coats against the autumn chill, their eyes fixed on the bend in the road where the forest met the town. They expected to see the ragged, soot-stained uniforms of their own retreating Wehrmacht, perhaps a few horse-drawn supply wagons, or a limping Panther tank. They expected the familiar sight of German desperation, men who looked like the ghosts of the army that had marched so confidently into Poland 5 years prior. Instead, the fog was pierced by the blunt, olive-drab nose of an M24 Chaffee light tank, its engine roaring with a raw, unrefined power that spoke of endless fuel reserves. It did not stop. It did not pause to ask for directions or to assess the terrain. Behind it came the jeeps, and behind those, the gargantuan GMC trucks of the American supply lines. The German civilians stood paralyzed. The soldiers they saw did not look like the decadent plutocrats described in the Völkischer Beobachter. They were young, well-fed, and moved with a casual, almost terrifying confidence. They looked like men who belonged to a world where hunger was a myth and industrial failure was an impossibility. The sensory details of this first contact were overwhelming. The Americans did not just bring guns, they brought a strange, cloying sweetness, the smell of Virginia tobacco and Hershey's chocolate, that drifted off the convoys and settled into the hungry lungs of the onlookers. But it was the speed of the transformation that truly stunned them. As the first wave of combat troops pushed through toward the Rhine, a second wave of engineers and military police descended upon the village. They moved with a practiced, assembly line rhythm. Within an hour of the first tank's arrival, 2 American soldiers jumped from the back of a truck, carrying hammers and a bundle of freshly sawed lumber. They approached the central crossroads of the village, a spot where a weathered stone marker had stood for centuries, pointing the way to Aachen and Cologne in fading Gothic script. With a lack of ceremony that bordered on the sacrilegious to the German observers, the Americans drove a sturdy wooden post into the soft earth. They began nailing boards to it, not hand-painted, hastily scribbled signs, but professionally stenciled, uniform markers in a bold, sans-serif typeface. The signs were bright, clear, and utterly authoritative. The villagers watched from their doorsteps, their faces masks of incomprehension. For years, the German state had been characterized by a complex, often redundant bureaucracy that required endless stamps and signatures, yet here was a foreign power that had arrived in their backyard and was already reordering their world with a hammer and nails. The Americans were not just occupying the land, they were renaming the flow of it. They were imposing a new geometry upon the German landscape, one dictated by the needs of a global logistics machine. One elderly woman, whose husband had served in the Great War, stared at a sign that read, "One way, to the front." She didn't need to speak English to understand the arrow. The arrow was a promise. It was an indication that the Americans knew exactly where they were going and, more importantly, they knew exactly how to get back. This was the historical context that mattered most. The German civilian had been told for years that the Allied forces were a disorganized rabble of disparate interests, yet here was the physical evidence of a terrifyingly singular purpose. The emotional contrast was a physical weight. The German people had been conditioned to sacrifice, to endure the total war, declared by Goebbels, with the belief that their discipline was their greatest weapon. But as they looked at the American soldiers, who sat on the bumpers of their trucks eating canned peaches and white bread while they waited for the traffic to clear, that discipline felt like a hollow shell. The American abundance was not a secret kept in a vault. It was being flaunted on the side of every road, codified in the very signs that now directed the traffic of an empire. The white-painted signpost stood in the center of the village, its fresh paint gleaming against the gray, battle-scarred backdrop of the Eifel. It was a simple object, yet to the civilians of Call, it was the first evidence of their total defeat. It was the mark of a civilization that had mastered the art of movement. The German silence had been shattered, not by a shout, but by the rhythmic thwack-thwack of a hammer securing a direction to a destiny they could no longer control. The hum of the American war machine was not merely a sound. It was an industrial symphony that resonated through the soil of the Rhineland. To the German civilians peering through lace curtains and from the shadows of bombed-out storefronts, the logistical tale of the American army was more terrifying than its teeth. They had been raised on the myth of the Blitzkrieg, a lightning war that relied on speed, audacity, and the desperate conservation of resources. They expected the Americans to be a motorized version of their own struggling forces, perhaps faster, but ultimately limited by the same constraints of mud, fuel, and mechanical fatigue. What they witnessed was the infrastructure of victory. It was a phenomenon that defied the German understanding of warfare. As the front lines pushed eastward, the wake of the army was filled not with chaos, but with a tidal wave of engineering. The Americans did not merely use the roads, they rebuilt them as they drove. German peasants, accustomed to the slow, methodical pace of local road crews, watched in disbelief as U.S. Army engineers deployed heavy machinery, bulldozers, graders, and massive steamrollers that appeared to eat the very landscape and spit out flattened, gravel-ready pathways in a matter of hours. This was the reality of the Red Ball Express and its offshoots. The German civilians saw trucks, thousands of them, stretching in unbroken lines from the western horizon to the eastern edge of their vision. These were not the diverse, mismatched vehicles the Wehrmacht had been forced to commandeer from across occupied Europe. These were uniform, mass-produced deuce and a halves, all painted the same flat, olive-drab green, all carrying identical crates of supplies. The sheer scale of this standardization suggested a factory floor that spanned an entire continent, a production line that started in Detroit and ended in the heart of Germany. In the eyes of a German veteran of the Eastern Front, now home on convalescent leave, the sight was a revelation of doom. He had seen the German army rely on horse-drawn carts for nearly 80% of its logistics. He had seen men freeze because a single rail line was severed. Now, he stood on a street corner in a small German town and watched a single American convoy pass for 3 hours without a single horse in sight. The American soldier didn't just have a rifle. He had a truck, and that truck had a spare tire, and that spare tire was made of fresh, black rubber, a material that had become a ghost in the Third Reich years ago. The emotional contrast was sharpening into a bitter clarity. The Nazi ideology had preached the superiority of the German will over materialism, yet the American material was proving to be an expression of a different kind of will. It was the will of a people who could afford to be precise. The American logistics were not frantic, they were methodical. This was most evident in the way they handled the geography of the Reich. The German civilians noticed that the Americans didn't seem to get lost. They didn't stop to consult tattered maps or argue over directions at crossroads. This was because of the signs. The white-painted boards began to appear with a frequency that felt like a psychological assault. At every junction, every bridge, and every fork in the road, the Americans erected markers that were as much a part of their kit as their helmets. These signs were not just directions, they were labels of ownership. To ammo dump 4, Pole Point, Red Diamond Route. To the German observer, these signs stripped the German landscape of its mystery and its history. Their ancient forests and medieval towns were being reclassified as sectors and waypoints in a giant, American-made grid. The recurring symbol of the white-painted signpost began to take on a deeper meaning. It represented a society that had so much lumber, so much paint, and so much surplus energy that it could afford to signpost a foreign nation better than the locals had ever done. To a civilian who had spent the last year scavenging for scraps of wood to heat a stove, the sight of a sturdy, fresh-cut signpost every few hundred yards was a staggering display of wealth. It was a weapon of wood and white lead, a silent testament to the fact that while Germany was out of everything, America was just getting started. The historical evidence of this engineering prowess was undeniable. In places where the retreating Wehrmacht had blown bridges in a desperate attempt to slow the tide, the Americans didn't even pause. They simply unfurled Bailey bridges, prefabricated steel structures that snapped together like children's toys. The German civilians watched as a gap that would have taken their own crews weeks to repair was bridged in an afternoon. Over these bridges flowed the never-ending stream of trucks, and beside each bridge, the inevitable white signpost appeared, telling the drivers exactly how much weight the span could hold and where it led. The message was clear. The American road was a one-way street, and it led directly to Berlin. By early 1945, the German landscape had become a canvas for a language its inhabitants could not speak, but whose meaning they understood with terrifying clarity. The language of the road had changed. The elegant, swirling Sutherland script of the German past was being systematically overlaid by the utilitarian block letters of the American military. To the civilians of the Rhineland and Westphalia, the arrival of these signs was the moment they realized the Reich had not just lost a war, it had lost its grip on the very concept of home. The Americans possessed a topographical confidence that bordered on the supernatural. German civilians watched as specialized units of the U.S. Army Map Service and the Corps of Engineers moved with a speed that suggested they had been studying these specific German villages for a lifetime. They brought with them crates of pre-stenciled signs that had been manufactured in depots in England or even back in the United States. These signs were not mere markers. They were the vocabulary of a new management. When a sign reading, "Keep moving, 200 yards between vehicles," appeared at the entrance to a centuries-old town square, it signaled that the town was no longer a community of people, but a high-capacity artery in a global circulatory system. The shock for the locals was not just in the presence of the English language, but in the precision of the American geography. The Germans had spent the last 2 years stripping their own road signs to confuse invading paratroopers and saboteurs. They had lived in a blurred world of unmarked intersections and intentional disorientation. Yet, the Americans arrived with maps so detailed they included individual farm tracks and the specific weight capacities of minor stone bridges. The civilians stood by the roadside, watching American GIs confidently hammer signs into the earth that pointed toward cities like Frankfurt, Kassel, or Munich with more accuracy than the locals could provide. The emotional contrast was staggering. For the German people, the road had become a place of terror, of strafing J-bows, Allied fighter bombers, and the chaotic flight of refugees pushing handcarts. For the Americans, the road was a place of supreme organization. The civilians saw that the Americans didn't just label the destinations, they labeled the hazards. Danger. Mines cleared to shoulders. Bridge out. Detour 2 miles. Slippery when wet. This was a level of care for the common soldier and the machine that was utterly alien to a population that had been told that their lives were expendable for the final victory. The white-painted signpost remained the recurring symbol of this new order. It was a stark, bright beacon of democratic efficiency. While the German state had focused its remaining energy on producing V-2 rockets and propaganda films, the Americans were focusing on the clarity of a crossroads. The civilians noted the wasteful perfection of the paint, a brilliant, reflective white that caught the moonlight, allowing the convoys to run through the night without headlights. To a people living under total blackout conditions for years, the sight of a sign that practically glowed in the dark was a revelation of a superior technology rooted in the mundane. Historical records of the period reflect the psychological impact of this signpost war. Captured German documents revealed a profound sense of inferiority among officers who saw American logistical signage. They realized that while they were fighting a war of individual heroism and tactical maneuvers, the Americans were conducting a war of industrial management. The signs were the physical manifestation of an ideology that valued the flow of goods and the safety of the operator. As the sun set over the ruins of the industrial roar, the silhouettes of these signposts stood like tombstones for the old regime. Every English word hammered into a German tree or post was a nail in the coffin of the Reich. The civilians realized that the Americans had mapped their country better than they had, because the Americans intended to stay until the job was done. The road no longer belonged to the people who lived beside it. It belonged to the men who had the paint, the lumber, and the maps to name every turn. The symbol of American logistical might was not a secret weapon or a sophisticated code. It was the white-painted signpost. To a German civilian who had spent years under the strength through joy propaganda, where even the most basic necessities were rationed to the point of extinction, the sight of these posts was a staggering display of symbols of abundance. They were crafted from fresh, sturdy lumber, pine and fir that smelled of distant, unscarred forests, and coated in a thick, brilliant white lead paint that seemed to repel the very grime of the war-torn landscape. In the German domestic economy of early 1945, a single plank of wood was a precious commodity, often scavenged from ruins to patch a roof or fuel a hearth. Yet, the Americans used wood with a casual, almost reckless extravagance. They didn't just place one sign at a crossroads. They placed clusters of them, each one perfectly squared and meticulously stenciled. The civilians watched as truckloads of these prefabricated signs were offloaded, thousands of board feet of lumber dedicated solely to the purpose of telling a driver where to find a specific motor pool or a field hospital. It was a waste that spoke of a nation whose resources were, for all practical purposes, infinite. The paint itself was a revelation. While the German Dunkelgelb, dark yellow, and Feldgrau, field gray, paints had become thin and watery, often substituted with lime washes that ran in the rain, the American white was opaque and enduring. It represented a society that still possessed the chemicals, the oils, and the labor to prioritize aesthetics and visibility. To the German eye, the white paint was a psychological beacon. It stood out against the charred skeletons of burnt-out Tiger tanks and the soot-stained walls of bombed bakeries. It was a color that didn't belong in a graveyard, yet it was being used to mark the path of an invading army. The abundance extended beyond the wood and paint to the very tools used to install them. German observers noted that American GIs didn't struggle with rusted hand tools. They had gleaming hammers, heavy-duty crowbars, and specialized post-hole diggers that made short work of the frozen German earth. This mechanical ease was the hallmark of a democracy that had industrialized the mundane. The soldiers themselves were the human component of this abundance. They were dressed in layers of high-quality wool and water-resistant canvas, their boots made of thick, supple leather that the average German civilian hadn't seen in half a decade. This contrast created a profound sense of ideological vertigo. The Reich had promised that German quality would triumph over American quantity, but as the civilians looked at the signposts, they realized that the Americans had achieved both. The signs were not just numerous, they were better than anything the German state had produced in years. They were a physical manifestation of a system that could afford to care about the details because it was not fighting for its literal survival, it was conducting a massive, overseas business venture called liberation. Every time a GI took a brush to touch up a scuff sign or used a stencil to add a new unit designation, he was broadcasting a message of American surplus. The signposts became silent sentinels of the new order. standing at every corner as proof that the Americans had brought their entire civilization with them. They hadn't just come to fight, they had come to build a network. To the German people, who were now living in a world of scarcity and ersatz substitutes, the white-painted signpost was the ultimate evidence that the war was already decided by the factories of Detroit and the forests of Oregon long before the first boot hit the soil of the Rhineland. As the American advance deepened into the heart of the Palatinate, the German populace witnessed a phenomenon that shattered their remaining faith in the Prussian ideal of military order. For decades, the German civilian had been taught that the Wehrmacht was the pinnacle of organizational discipline, a rigid, clockwork machine where every cog moved according to a central, infallible will. Yet, as the Reich collapsed, that machine had evolved into a frantic, shouting mess of conflicting orders and stalled columns. In its place came the contrast of order, the American military police and their effortless management of the chaos. The Americans didn't seem to shout. To the German observers, the GIs directed the greatest concentrations of motorized power in human history with a casual flick of a wrist or a languid wave of a gloved hand. At the center of this order was the snowball, the American military policeman in his iconic white helmet, white gaiters, and white gloves. Standing at a muddy, shell-pocked intersection, the MP was the human counterpart to the white-painted signpost. He was a beacon of calm in a world of fire. The civilians watched from the ruins as these MPs managed traffic circles that appeared overnight. There was no panic screaming of Heil Hitler, no threats of execution for defeatism against drivers whose trucks had broken down. Instead, there was a specialized, professional detachment. If a vehicle stalled, a specialized recovery crane, another marvel of American engineering, appeared almost instantly to hoist it aside, keeping the veins of the army open. The Germans saw that the American order was not based on fear, but on a pre-planned, streamlined logic that assumed success. The documented reality of this period shows that German civilians were often more afraid of their own retreating, flying courts-martial than they were of the American occupiers. The Americans brought a different kind of authority, one that was rooted in the predictable and the visible. The signs were the backbone of this predictability. A German civilian noted in a diary that while the German authorities were busy burning documents and changing into civilian clothes to hide, the Americans were busy putting up signs that told people where they could get water and where the off-limits zones began. This American order was characterized by its transparency. The signs didn't hide the military's intent, they broadcasted it. Main supply route, one-way traffic. Keep off the shoulders. By contrast, the Nazi state had thrived on secrecy and the need-to-know principle, leaving the average citizen in a permanent state of confusion and dread. The American signposts stripped away the fog of war. They provided a structured environment where even a conquered enemy could understand the rules of the new world. The recurring symbol of the white-painted signpost stood as a silent rebuke to the Führer principle. The signs showed that the American system functioned because it was a network of shared information, not a hierarchy of terror. The paint on the signs was always fresh, the lettering always clear. This visual consistency suggested that even if the individual soldier standing at the crossroads were killed, the system, the sign, would remain to guide the next man. It was a terrifyingly resilient form of order that the German people, now witnessing the total disintegration of their own state, viewed with a mixture of resentment and profound, quiet awe. The contrast was most visible at the river crossings. While German forces often drowned or were captured because of bottlenecks at the few remaining bridges, the Americans used their signs to create multi-lane, one-way systems that moved entire divisions across the Rhine in a single night. To the Germans watching from the hills, the lights of the American convoys, guided by the reflective white of the signs, looked like a glowing serpent of inevitable progress. The American order wasn't just about winning the war, it was about the total, systematic administration of the peace that was to follow. The transition from conqueror to captive brought with it a profound psychological shift and for the thousands of German soldiers being herded into the Rhineland Rhine meadow camps, the prisoners' epiphany began with a view from the back of an open-topped truck. As they were transported across the very land they had sworn to defend to the death, they were confronted with a spatial reality that shattered their military pride. They were no longer masters of the German soil. They were cargo being moved through an American warehouse. Captured officers, many of whom had spent years studying maps of the Soviet Union or the French coast, were struck by a singular, humiliating realization: the Americans had a superior grasp of the German interior. As the POW trucks rolled through the outskirts of cities like Frankfurt and Mainz, the prisoners saw the white-painted signpost at every intersection. These were not the poetic, traditional markers of the Heimat. They were functional, cold, and written in English. To see a sign reading Detour, to POW Enclosure 12, hammered into a post beneath a shattered German oak, was to see the total loss of territorial sovereignty. The historical records of these captive journeys describe a haunting silence among the men. They watched as American drivers ignored the ancient landmarks and instead followed a trail of breadcrumbs made of plywood and paint. The Americans had effectively bypassed the German mental map. They didn't need to know the history of the Kaiserstrasse, they only needed to know it was now Route A. The German soldiers, who had been taught that their connection to the land was mystical and bloodbound, saw that the Americans viewed the land as a series of engineering problems to be solved with gravel and signage. The emotional contrast was particularly sharp for the Lancer infantrymen, who had spent the war on the Eastern Front. In Russia, the vastness was the enemy. There were no signs, only the endless, unmarked steppe that swallowed armies whole. Here, in their own country, the Americans had conquered the vastness through labeling. The prisoners realized that the American victory was not just a result of more tanks, but of a more efficient way of seeing the world. The Americans did not fight the terrain, they managed it. The recurring symbol of the white-painted signpost acted as a psychological barrier between the prisoners and their former lives. Every time a truck turned according to an American sign, the prisoner was reminded that his own government could no longer even tell him which way was north. The signs represented a transition from the chaos of the final struggle to the structured, predictable reality of American captivity. To the prisoner, the sign was a symbol of a machine that never slept and never lost its way. This epiphany was the beginning of the end for the Nazi ideology in the minds of many soldiers. They saw that the American plutocracy had produced a system of such overwhelming clarity that resistance was not just difficult, but mathematically impossible. The road signs were the physical manifestation of a logic that had already won. As the trucks pulled into the sprawling, barbed wire enclosures, the last thing many prisoners saw was a white signpost pointing toward the gate, marking the final stop on a journey from a delusional empire to a stark, supervised reality. The transition from conqueror to captive brought with it a profound psychological shift, and for the thousands of German soldiers being herded into the Rhineland Rhine meadow camps, the prisoners' epiphany began with the view from the back of an open-topped truck. As they were transported across the very land they had sworn to defend to the death, they were confronted with a spatial reality that shattered their military pride. They were no longer masters of the German soil. They were cargo being moved through an American warehouse. Captured officers, many of whom had spent years studying maps of the Soviet Union or the French coast, were struck by a singular, humiliating realization: the Americans had a superior grasp of the German interior. As the POW trucks rolled through the outskirts of cities like Frankfurt and Mainz, the prisoners saw the white-painted signpost at every intersection. These were not the poetic, traditional markers of the Heimat. They were functional, cold, and written in English. To see a sign reading Detour, to POW Enclosure 12, hammered into a post beneath a shattered German oak, was to see the total loss of territorial sovereignty. The historical records of these captive journeys describe a haunting silence among the men. They watched as American drivers ignored the ancient landmarks and instead followed a trail of breadcrumbs made of plywood and paint. The Americans had effectively bypassed the German mental map. They didn't need to know the history of the Kaiserstrasse, they only needed to know it was now Route A. The German soldiers, who had been taught that their connection to the land was mystical and bloodbound, saw that the Americans viewed the land as a series of engineering problems to be solved with gravel and signage. The emotional contrast was particularly sharp for the Lancer infantrymen, who had spent the war on the Eastern Front. In Russia, the vastness was the enemy. There were no signs, only the endless, unmarked steppe that swallowed armies whole. Here, in their own country, the Americans had conquered the vastness through labeling. The prisoners realized that the American victory was not just a result of more tanks, but of a more efficient way of seeing the world. The Americans did not fight the terrain. They managed it. The recurring symbol of the white-painted signpost acted as a psychological barrier between the prisoners and their former lives. Every time a truck turned according to an American sign, the prisoner was reminded that his own government could no longer even tell him which way was north. The signs represented a transition from the chaos of the final struggle to the structured, predictable reality of American captivity. To the prisoner, the sign was a symbol of a machine that never slept and never lost its way. This epiphany was the beginning of the end for the Nazi ideology in the minds of many soldiers. They saw that the American plutocracy had produced a system of such overwhelming clarity that resistance was not just difficult, but mathematically impossible. The road signs were the physical manifestation of a logic that had already won. As the trucks pulled into the sprawling, barbed wire enclosures, the last thing many prisoners saw was a white signpost pointing toward the gate, marking the final stop on a journey from a delusional empire to a stark, supervised reality. By the spring of 1945, the sight of a single American road sign had become more demoralizing to the German civilian than the roar of a bomber formation. It was the realization that the American war effort was not a frantic sprint, but a sustained, industrial marathon. This was the era of logistics as a psychological weapon. The German people, who had been told to tighten their belts for the Endsieg, looked upon the American supply lines and saw a civilization that didn't know the meaning of the word ration. The signs were the primary evidence of this bottomless well of resources. German civilians noted that the Americans didn't just signpost the way to the front, they signposted the way to their comforts. In the middle of charred, starving cities, signs appeared pointing toward ice cream plant, donut dugout, and mobile laundry unit. To a mother who had not seen a drop of fresh milk or a bar of real soap in years, these signs were a cruel, silent testament to American superiority. The signs broadcasted that the U.S. Army could fight a global war and still provide its men with the trivial luxuries of home. The historical data from this period highlights the shock of the mundane. It wasn't the atomic bomb or the heavy tank that broke the civilian spirit. It was the realization that the Americans had so much shipping capacity that they were transporting thousands of tons of paper, ink, and lumber across the Atlantic just to label their parking lots. The German civilian, who was now using newspaper for shoe liners, saw the American signpost as a display of imperial arrogance, or rather, imperial capability. The recurring symbol of the white-painted signpost served as the ultimate psychological barrier. Every time a German citizen crossed a street, they were forced to navigate a world that was being relabeled in real time. The signs were always clean, always upright, and always replaced if damaged. This suggested a level of maintenance and spare parts that the German state had long ago abandoned. It told the observer that the American machine was self-healing. If you destroyed a tank, there were 10 more. If you knocked down a sign, another would be hammered in before the dust settled. The emotional contrast was a transition from defiance to a weary, cynical acceptance. The civilians realized that the American presence was not a passing storm, but a new climate. The signs were the first permanent fixtures of this new atmosphere. They were the physical proof that the Americans had brought an entire economy with them. The logistical tail was so long and so well-fed that it had effectively smothered the German ability to even imagine a counteroffensive. The signs became a form of administrative terror. They showed that the Americans had already planned for the aftermath. Water point, civilians prohibited, displaced persons assembly center, military governor. These markers stripped away the illusion of local control. The German people were no longer participants in their own history. They were subjects of a logistical grid. The white-painted post was the flag of a nation that conquered not with slogans, but with the overwhelming, undeniable fact of its own abundance. The irony of the late war period was etched into the very pavement of the German motorway system. The Autobahn, once the crowning jewel of Nazi engineering and a propaganda symbol of a unified, forward-thrusting Reich, had become the ghost of the Autobahn. Built to move German panzers to the borders of Europe, it was now being used as a high-speed conduit for the destruction of the regime that created it. To the German civilians hiding in the drainage culverts beneath the overpasses, the road was no longer theirs. It was a foreign artery pulsing with an alien vitality. The Americans did not just use the Autobahn. They mastered it in a way the fuel-starved Germans never could. Because the retreating Wehrmacht had sabotaged the overpasses and cratered the concrete, the civilians expected the American advance to stall. Instead, they watched as the U.S. Army engineers treated the highway like a massive, modular puzzle. Where a bridge had been dropped, a white-painted sign appeared. Detour. Follow the arrow. The arrow led down a steep, gravel-packed embankment, across a temporary pontoon bridge, and back up onto the pristine concrete on the other side. The recurring symbol of the white-painted signpost took on a ghostly quality against the backdrop of the deserted, blackened stretches of the highway. On a road designed for the people's car that never arrived, the Americans had erected signs for things the German public could barely conceive of. Signs for refueling point, 5 miles stood as a mocking reminder that while German Tiger tanks were being abandoned for lack of gasoline, the American Liberator trucks were being beckoned toward oceans of fuel. Historical evidence from the spring of 1945 shows that the Americans essentially Americanized the German road network overnight. They didn't just put up directions, they put up safety warnings that reflected a culture of individual value. Don't be a statistic, drive sober, or death is so permanent. To the German observer, who had been raised in a cult of sacrifice for the state, these signs were a bizarre, almost touching revelation. The Americans cared if their drivers lived to see the next town. The road was not a path to a glorious death, it was a path to a successful delivery. The emotional contrast was found in the speed of the American movement. The Autobahn, which had been largely empty of civilian traffic during the war years, was now a roaring river of steel. The civilians realized that the decadent Americans had a tempo of life and war that surpassed their own. The signs were the metronome of that tempo. They allowed the convoys to maintain a constant, relentless speed, even through the night. The ghost of the Autobahn was the realization that the German people had built the stage, but the Americans had brought the actors, the lights, and the script. As the sun caught the white paint of a signpost standing near the ruin of a massive stone eagle, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The eagle was cracked and weathered, a relic of a 1,000-year dream that had lasted barely 12. Beside it, the American sign was bright, fresh, and functional. It didn't care about the 1,000-year future, it cared about the next 20 miles. The German civilians, watching the trucks vanish into the haze of the horizon, understood that the future was no longer a Germanic myth, but an American logistical reality. The road was open, and it led away from the darkness of the Reich toward a world defined by the clarity of the sign. As the iron grip of the Nazi state dissolved into the mud of a rainy German spring, a subtle shift occurred in the hearts of those who lived along the main supply routes. This was the period of the story defined by the space beyond the arrow. To the German civilian, the American road signs began to represent something more than the movement of an invading army. They became the first inklings of a post-war identity. Amidst the ruins of a society that had been governed by the no of the Gestapo and the wait of the ration line, the American signs were a series of affirmative directives. They told the people where life was starting to resume. In towns like Marburg and Gießen, civilians who had spent weeks in cellars began to use the American logistical grid as their own map for survival. They followed the arrows. A sign reading Civilian Relief Station or Water Point was a beacon that transcended language. These markers were the first tangible evidence that the Americans intended to govern, not just destroy. The historical records of local mayors and parish priests from 1945 often mention how the American markers provided a sense of structural stability when every German institution had evaporated. The clarity of the English block letters offered a strange comfort, a promise that someone, somewhere, was in control of the chaos. The emotional contrast was found in the stories of the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. As they began the gargantuan task of clearing millions of tons of brick and mortar by hand, they worked in the shadow of these white-painted signposts. To these women, the signs were a symbol of a world where things worked. They saw American soldiers using the same white paint to mark out safety zones and footpaths through the debris. The sign was no longer just a military tool. It was an invitation to a different kind of order, one based on the pragmatic restoration of daily life rather than the ideological purification of the race. The recurring symbol of the white signpost became a psychological anchor for a generation of German youth as well. For the Wolfskinder and the orphans of the war, the American signs were their first introduction to a new vocabulary. They learned the words stop, go, and danger, not from a textbook, but from the sturdy wooden boards that lined their streets. The signs represented a future that was beyond the arrow of military conquest. They pointed toward a world of motion, of global connection, and of a brand of freedom that was inextricably linked to the ability to travel safely from one point to another. The historical evidence suggests that this period was the true beginning of the Americanization of the German psyche. It wasn't just the jazz or the cigarettes. It was the admiration for the efficiency of the sign. The German people, who had always prided themselves on their own Ordnung, were forced to admit that the American version was more resilient because it was more visible and more inclusive. The signs didn't require a secret handshake or a party membership. They only required an eye to see and a willingness to follow the direction. As the smoke cleared from the final pockets of resistance, the landscape remained dotted with these silent, white sentinels. To the civilian walking past them, the signs were a reminder that the old borders, both physical and mental, had been erased. The American road was a path out of the nightmare. It was a roadmap toward a new identity, one where the German citizen would eventually stop being a subject of a regime and start being a traveler in a wider, democratic world. The signs were the first landmarks of that journey, standing firm in the German dirt, pointing the way toward a horizon that was no longer red with fire, but white with the promise of a fresh start. By May 1945, the thunder of the guns had finally died away, replaced by the persistent, rhythmic clicking of American tires over the expansion joints of the reconstructed highways. In this final chapter, the horizon of freedom, the temporary wooden markers that had guided an army from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of the Elbe underwent a final, symbolic transformation. As the dust of combat settled, specialized U.S. Army units did not pack up their stencils and saws. Instead, they began to replace the battle-worn, mud-splattered boards with permanent fixtures. The transition from an occupied territory to a supervised, burgeoning democracy was being written in white paint and steel. The German civilians, emerging into the blinding light of a world without a Führer, looked upon these signs as the final punctuation marks of the war. The white-painted signpost had evolved. It no longer merely pointed toward ammo dumps or prisoner enclosures. It now directed the flow of the Marshall Plan. Signs appeared pointing toward Food Distribution Center, Reconstruction Headquarters, and School Zone. The language of the road had shifted from the imperatives of destruction to the vocabulary of a civil society. To the German eye, the persistence of these signs was a revelation. It signaled that the Americans were not a transient raiding party, but a foundational force that intended to anchor the shattered nation to the west. The historical evidence of this era lies in the physical remnants of the occupation. In the archives of the early post-war years, there is a clear documentation of how the American grid became the blueprint for the new West German state. The efficiency that had stunned the civilians in the winter of 1944 became the aspirational standard for the 1950s. The German people did not just adopt American logistics, they internalized the ideology behind them, the idea that a transparent, well-marked path is the greatest safeguard of a free people. The signposts were the first teachers of a new kind of discipline, one rooted in cooperation and the common good rather than blind, fearful obedience. The emotional contrast reached its poetic peak in the sight of German children playing in the shadows of these signposts. To a boy born into the hunger of the 1940s, the white post was not a symbol of a conqueror, but a landmark of a world that provided. It was the place where the Amish would park their trucks to hand out chewing gum. It was the marker that told his father which road led to a job in the city. The fear that had once gripped the village of Kahl when the first Chaffee tank roared through had been replaced by a quiet, industrious hope. The American abundance, once a psychological weapon, was now the fuel for a German recovery. The recurring symbol of the white signpost remains a silent witness to this larger truth about freedom. In the end, the most powerful thing the Americans brought to Germany was not the Sherman tank or the P-51 Mustang, but the clarity of the arrow. They brought a system that valued the individual's journey and provided the tools to ensure they reached their destination. The signs were a manifestation of a democracy that functioned with the same relentless, bright precision in the dark of night as it did in the light of day. As the sun sets over the modern Autobahn, where the echoes of the ghost have long since faded into the hum of a peaceful Europe, one can still see the legacy of those first wooden boards. The poetic reflection of the German experience is found in the transition from the dark, winding paths of an insular empire to the bright, open horizons of a connected world. The white paint may have faded and the wooden posts may have been replaced by aluminum and reflective glass, but the truth remains. Freedom is not just an idea, but a road that must be built, maintained, and clearly marked for all to follow. The American signs did more than show the way to Berlin. They showed a broken people the way back to themselves.